With the release of Cassandra Nova and Copycat, we are now out of cards that are going to be releasing in the month of July, which means it's time to look ahead to the cards that are releasing in August. There are going to be 5 of them, and they are extremely exciting. First up is Kate Bishop, the Season Pass card, aka Young Hawkeye. This is a 2/3 with an on reveal ability that adds 2 arrows to your hand. Now, arrows are cards. These are cards that you're gonna be actually spending energy on playing out. So this is a card that at base is a 2/3 that adds 2 cards to your hand. As far as I'm able to tell, the arrow pool is currently 4 cards that may be subject to change, and these are the 4 arrows of which you will get 2. Arrow number 1 is Acid Arrow, which I consider to be the strongest of these arrows and maybe the strongest thing that this card does overall. Effectively, this is a 1 energy, 2 power Green Goblin. So where Green Goblin is a 3 energy, -3 power card, this is a 1 energy, -2 power card. Of course, if this card actually existed on its own, it would be completely insane. But since it is a consequence of Kate Bishop, you aren't getting this every time you play Kate Bishop. As I understand math, you should be getting this about half the time you play Kate Bishop, which is reasonable enough like sort of nerf to a card like this. But what really scares me about this is just how free it seems to include this random clog in your deck. And between Kate Bishop and White Widow, there's now just going to be a decent amount of just freely included clog that you're not actually paying a huge cost for. Kate Bishop into White Widow plus Acid Arrow is actually like 2 units on your opponent's side of the board that you don't really have to worry about at all. And where White Widow has that ongoing ability that makes it so that the negative power is not so overwhelming when you actually fill that lane up, giving it a bit of diminishing returns with a bunch of actual clog, this card does not. This card actually just says -2. I think that if any of these arrows are going to be strong, if any of Kate Bishop is going to be a meta-relevant card, this arrow is going to be why, because of just how oppressive it can be to clog up one of your opponent's board spots with absolutely no recourse. Honestly, this is a better thing to clog with than Widow's Bite a lot of the time, because Widow's Bite has that ongoing ability that allows your opponent to sort of not necessarily make up for the fact that they're missing a spot, but allows them to not have to sit there with that negative power there permanently. This card just has that negative power. It's a very powerful card. Next up is Grapple Arrow, a way for cards to get into locations they're typically a little bit harder to get into. However, this card, rather than sending things out of a location, is dragging them to a location, which means it's not as good as something like Jeff at getting into truly closed-off locations. You can't really play this into a location like Sanctum Sanctorum or anything like that. What you can do is play it into the locations that sort of kill your cards as you play them there, like Altar of Death or Death's Domain, or locations that transform your cards like Tarnax if you want to make sure that you have something in the location that is meaningfully large that you have full control over. This is, I think, one of the, I won't say filler, but when you compare it to Acid Arrow, it does seem to have a little bit less raw power. One thing to note about this, though, is it is just 1/3 that you're getting for free. You just have this ability to, oh, I'm floating 1 energy, guess I'm playing a 1/3 this turn. And that, I think, is where a lot of the true strength of a card like Kate Bishop lies, where when I think about why this card is good, a lot of it is just you get all this stuff for free on a body that at 2/3 is not actually going to be that much smaller than the comparable bodies at the cost, right? So when I look at Kate Bishop, I see her free-rolling a lot of these effects, because most 2-drops are not meaningfully bigger than 2/3 if they're a utility card, as opposed to, say, Angela or Thena, right? Same stat line as Jeff. The only question is whether free-rolling these effects is better than Jeff's ability. The last 2 arrows are actually just straight-up 1-drops that exist in the game. Basic Arrow is Hawkeye. It's the card Hawkeye. It's a 1-drop, and then you play a card on it, and it gets more power later next turn. So this is actually literally just the card Hawkeye, the original Hawkeye. Shout out to Jeremy Renner and the Renner app. This card will allow you to have extra power for effectively free. I would, if I had to guess, say that Basic Arrow is probably the worst of the arrows, because Hawkeye, and again, like we talk about like basic arrow generally, like Hawkeye's the worst of the cards that these are modeled off of, but also the reason Hawkeye is bad generally is because of that delayed trigger. If this card had a trigger that was just the next card you play here triggers it, I think both this card and Hawkeye would be much better. But the specifics of why it's not great is that it's kind of a little bit awkward and a little bit bad on turn 6. And that's usually the most important time to actually be good and not bad in a game, because you have this delayed trigger that sort of either you're playing it on 5 and telegraphing what's happening there, or you're playing it on 6 and not getting any of the value out of it. Finally, we have Pym Arrow, which is pre-buff Ant-Man. So it's a 1/4 Ant-Man instead of a 1/5 Ant-Man. And I think that's also perfectly acceptable, right? Like, when you look at what this card is giving you, Kate Bishop, not Pym Arrow, obviously, you're getting 2 reasonable 1-drops for the price of this card goes in your deck. And I think that that is a reasonable value proposition. The highlight to me is clearly Acid Arrow, but it's not like any of these cards are like actively bad. They're just the kind of cards that you'd struggle to get into your deck normally. And I think that's a really interesting note, because 1-drops are very hard to get into a deck that is not very focused on 1-drops, but there are a lot of decks that could use 1-drops to sort of smooth out their curve. An example would be a lot of Thena decks, when they don't draw Kitty Pryde, could really use those 1-drops so they can go 3+1 on turn 4. A lot of that kind of stuff actually is fairly impactful. It's just not the kind of thing that's impactful enough to actually include in your deck. Rather, it just ends up impactful enough that you want to try to free roll it, and that's what Kate Bishop allows you to do. My real question for Kate Bishop is, how many decks does she go in? And I think the obvious comparison to draw here is with Jeff. And while I was prepping for this video, I know it may seem ridiculous that I'm saying I prep for videos, but I do. While I was prepping for this video, I came across something that really sort of clarified why I think Kate Bishop has a real chance to succeed. When you look at every other stat line in the game, the vanilla stat line has been meaningfully power crept. At 1 cost, we have a vanilla stat line of 1/2, and now we just got a 1/5 in Hydra Bob, whose ability isn't even really a downside, right? It's very clearly a better card than Misty Knight by a massive amount. When you look at the 3-drop, the average good 3-drop right now is a 3/5, right? Like, we look at Nocturne, we look at Copycat, these are 3/5s. The vanilla stat line is a 3/4. These are 3/5s with upside. When you look at the 4-drop slot, I mean, people play Call Obsidian, right? Like, that's very far beyond the thing. And even if you're talking about, like, the base set of Marvel Snap, Jessica Jones and Rescue, and all of these cards are very far beyond what the thing is able to bring to bear. At the 5-drop slot, we have the recently released Ajax, we have Darkhawk, we have Ronin, we have Devil Dinosaur. Cards can get like as big as 17 power. Gilgamesh sometimes gets to 20. Ajax sometimes gets to 20+. Much bigger than Abomination's 5/9. And of course, at the 6-drop slot, going to 6/12, right? That's what the Hulk is. We have the Blob, who is very often much larger than that. And I think there are several other examples like Red Hulk and Magneto, who's a 6/12 with upside. There's a lot to cover there, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that in most cases, the power ceiling, in as much as those are supposed to be power ceiling, which is not really, but the vanilla stat lines have been very power crept. And I think the one place this isn't true is 2-drops, where the best 2-drops in the game are 2/3s with upside a lot of the time. I think you can argue, you know, Thena massively power crept stuff, sure, right? Like, there are scalers at 2 and 3 that are going to be much bigger than that, but the utility pieces at 3 are 3/5s now, and the utility pieces at 2 are still 2/3s. Jeff is the main competition for this card. And when you think about what makes Jeff good and what makes this card good, my instinct is that a lot of people are going to look at this card and say, oh, this is better than Jeff. It does more stuff than Jeff. And I wanted to take a couple seconds to talk about why Jeff is good, why Internal Move is one of the most powerful abilities in the game. Basically, the way you win Marvel Snap games is by winning 2 out of the 3 locations. Having that flexibility to choose where your power is going to be allocated later in the game is incredibly powerful, and that flexibility also allows you to avoid your investments in certain locations getting invalidated, because the major way to win Marvel Snap games is by winning the high leverage locations where both of you are investing. If you win those, you typically end up winning the game as a whole, because those are the locations things tend to hinge on. This card, Jeff, allows you to not actually invest in those things permanently, and you get this critical mass of movers, Jeff, Nocturne Vision, and suddenly you're not really investing in anything, your power can be anywhere, and you can do whatever you want on the final turn of the game. So Jeff is very, very strong. The case for Kate Bishop being stronger is that adding 2 cards to your hand is unprecedentedly good. The cards themselves are quite solid, especially Acid Arrow, and she serves as a remarkable curve filler for any deck that is looking to do things at a specific time. There are many decks that are like, I really wanted to play this 3-drop on 4, but I kind of can't right now. Or if you're a Athena deck, I really wish I had a Kitty Pryde so I could be playing 1-drops alongside these other cards so that I could proc my Athena. That's the kind of deck that wants this card. In addition, I think this card, very obviously, a lot of people are going to say, is probably going to go into Loki, right? It's a 2/3 that adds 2 cards to your hand. How bad can that possibly be? But I do think there is like a sort of give and take there, where we have Snowguard, we have Coulson, we have this card. Suddenly, we're going to have a lot of potential hand management issues. One of the underrated issues with Loki as a deck, outside of the context of Arishem, of course, is that it ends up in a situation where you really need to draw the card Loki, but you also have a lot of, like, your ability to play cards is predicated on, you know, these are cards that put cards in hand. So if you play, like, Snowguard on 1, and then you don't have a 2-drop for 2, you can't play Coulson on 3 without preventing your ability to draw a card on 4. And that's usually kind of an issue that you are going to run into, especially with a card that fills your hand up like this. The fact that they are 1s means they are easily removable from the hand, and the fact that they are good is also quite impactful. Overall, my read on Kate Bishop is she will, on release, be a card that people will compare to Jeff, and we will have to find out which one of them is better in the long term for a variety of decks. One other real synergy that I want to highlight with Kate Bishop, yeah, it's Mockingbird. Of course, we're going to talk about Mockingbird. So, when I think about Kate Bishop and where her most immediate home is, my instinct is those Mysterio Mockingbird decks that already play Athena. That's where I want to be playing Kate Bishop, because she overlaps with Mockingbird. She gives you these extra cards so you can make sure your Athena is proccing. These are extra cards that go in your Angela. None of them are actually all that bad. You're fine playing them on rate. They fill up your curve. My instinct is she will probably actually be better than Jeff in that deck, and I think that is a meaningful note to make because this is a really interesting card, and we have not had a card that is actually capable of dethroning Jeff at 2-drops in a very long time. I'm not saying she's necessarily going to, but I can absolutely see a path for this card becoming the new Jeff. Marvel Boy is a 3/2 with the ability to, at the end of every turn, give 3 of your 1-cost cards 1 power additionally. Now, this card is interesting to me because we've been in metagames where Zoo has been good already, and I think a lot of the dynamic of why that was that people weren't hard targeting it very much, and that there wasn't like a massive meta predator able to like tech against it very easily. One card that I think is going to be very important for Marvel Boy is, of course, Squirrel Girl. Squirrel Girl into Marvel Boy does seem like a massive amount of power, a truly ridiculous amount of power, but by the same token, it's a very vulnerable amount of power, with both Killmonger and Shadow King able to deal with what is being put on the board. Killmonger especially is what I think will likely keep these kind of decks in check, making Kyera a much more required card in these Zoo decks if they end up being good. The dynamic that Zoo has with Killmonger is actually pretty interesting, because there's this back and forth of Zoo wanting to run other cards than Kyera, but when Killmonger hits a high enough sort of appearance rate, you don't really have the choice. And so when you run Kyera, you end up in these mirror matches where your opponent on Zoo who isn't running Kyera has a more relevant card in terms of point generation, and then you end up in a spot where you're losing the mirror match, and then that encourages you to take Kyera out of the deck, and then you run into the Killmonger decks, and you can't really do that anymore. I'm very interested to see what this actually does to Zoo, because I enjoyed when Zoo was a deck that was sitting near the top of the metagame. That was very, very fun for me. However, I don't necessarily think it changes any of the like specific dynamics the deck has. It'll probably play exactly how it already plays, just, you know, not necessarily, just maybe a little bit stronger thanks to Marvel Boy. The issues that Zoo has are really clog issues. This is a deck that struggles when there are a lot of things that are looking to clog your board up, because it is a deck that really, really is built for playing 6 turns and making sure that you fill all your board spaces on those 6 turns. Those are the sort of criteria that when you build around Gilgamesh Blue Marvel as a core, you end up wanting to fulfill. And when you build a deck that is very good at fulfilling those, you end up building a deck that is not very good when those situations are disrupted. Zoo is a great deck at winning normal Marvel Snap games, 6-turn games that your opponent isn't really interacting with you all that much in. It's not a great deck when it is getting interacted with, whether that be by Dr. Octopus or Professor X or even Leech. These are cards that are like meaningfully disruptive. It's also not a great deck into the card Loki, because Loki is able to play so many of the good cards in the Zoo deck right back at them and match them power for power. This is a long way of saying that even if Arishem isn't still around when Marvel Boy releases, I think that it could end up with Zoo not being a meaningfully powerful deck or a meaningfully different deck from what it already is. I think this card is strong, but I think Zoo is already strong enough to compete and be a thing people think about. Its issues are far more with metagame positioning than they are with raw strength. Here is where things get super weird in August. This is Wiccan. Wiccan is a 4/5 with an on reveal ability that says if you've already spent all of your energy this game, you get +2 energy, which is a really interesting ability for a card to have. I can tell you, as someone who might be the only person to ever play Domino in High Infinite, realistically, I have a lot of sympathy for the idea of what if we made Quicksilver Domino into an actual deck. I don't know that this is going to do it. I think that the fact that this becoming an actual deck is like a very hard thing to accomplish. I do think that it is a meaningful enough change to that, or a meaningful enough buff to that kind of thing, that I will want to try it, because deep in my heart of hearts, I hate missing cards on curve. I hate it so much. My inner Magic the Gathering mono red player, my inner Hearthstone Murloc Paladin player, I hate it. I want to go 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want the game to be over. That's what I want. That's what I want, and that's what I want this card to be able to let me do. I don't know if it's going to be able to do that. There are a couple of alts that I want to talk about here, because I'm talking about Quicksilver Domino, but it's also possible that you have something that's just like Quicksilver Zabu Psylocke, right? And then suddenly you're getting this out on turn 3, you have 6 energy on turn 4, and obviously the earlier you can exercise something like this, the better that it is. And that is a really interesting kind of dynamic, because when you put Quicksilver Domino in your deck, you end up less likely to actually draw this card by turn 4, which is an issue. When you are playing just the Quicksilver, yes, you're less likely to draw this card by turn 4, but not as unlikely to do it as when one of your cards in opening hand and your second draw of the game is taken up by Quicksilver and Domino. So I do think it's possible that rather than being a Quicksilver Domino card, this ends up being a card where you play maybe Quicksilver, maybe a bunch of 1-drops, not really sure, but then you accelerate into it with Psylocke and Zabu instead. That's quite interesting to me. Again, the other thing I wanted to talk about, though, with this card is I'm not sure what the payoff is supposed to be. I know this sounds weird when we're in a metagame where Arishem is as strong as it is, but, like, Arishem is ahead the whole game. It's not making any sacrifices to get there, and because of that, it's just kind of able to play whatever. Like, your generic 5-drop is still going to be bigger than most 4-drops, and it just gets to be like, all right, I'm fine with doing whatever there. I don't really care. I'll play Abomination on your turn 4. It's still bigger than your 4-drop, right? This deck needs to deck build for that, and I think that's very difficult, because you need to deck build for a successful Wiccan, while also being a deck that can play the game without a successful Wiccan. And I feel like that's actually just a very hard challenge to meet. I'm not really sure what it would do, what it would look like, what any of this actually looks like in practice, because I don't think we've seen a lot of evidence that, like, Doom Odin stuff, or just, like, 6-drop into 6-drop is actually good enough, right? When you look at a deck like Arishem, what it's doing to win is, like, disruptive 5-drops, Blob, who is bigger than anything you're going to be able to actually put in this deck, and then, like, counterplay cards like Shang-Chi, and it's like, I don't really know how to put a deck together around this card. It is an interesting deck building challenge, and one that I think is gonna, like, it's gonna, however it lands, I think it's probably going to faceplant a little bit when it first comes out, because it's just going to be so hard to figure out what the actual best thing to do with it is. And I think it's a lot less obviously strong than something like Arishem was. Speed is, if there is one card in this group of cards that I think legitimately might need a buff, it is Speed, which is weird because if you use all your energy, this is just a 3/9. That's a pretty good number. Like, maybe it doesn't need a buff, but I think, like, part of me, I'm looking at this and I'm like, it's harder to use all your energy than you think. It just is, right? So, like, a lot of the time this comes out, it's a 3/7. Is that meaningfully better enough than a Nocturne to see play? And I don't really know. I think that, like, it is weird that I'm talking about it like this, because when I say it, it doesn't sound all that bad. Like, let's say you're just, let's say you float energy 2 turns of the game. Your opponent's Red Hulk is 16 power. That's like a fairly common outcome, and I actually think that Speed ends up quite strong then. Like, you're happy with a 3/7 a lot of the time. My worry with this card isn't so much that it, like, needs a buff to be playable, it's that it's not an exciting card to buy. And, like, that does seem like kind of an issue, where there's, like, a delta between a card that is playable and a card that people will want to buy. And I think a lot of this is because of the Marvel Snap economy, where all these cards are priced at the same amount. Arishem costs the same as Speed, but Speed is, like, pretty okay, and Arishem is an archetype unto itself. And I think there's this issue that the developers might be running into, where if you make a pretty okay card, that's the right place for it to be on balance, but it might not be the right place for it to be, assuming that is the one piece of content your game is getting in a given week. And I think that that is a sort of systemic issue that should probably be addressed. Speed itself, like, this card, honestly, it's fine. It's probably just a perfectly fine to good card. I wouldn't be surprised if people played a lot of this card. Like, when I see 3/7, I'm like, yeah, okay, that rocks. I would love to do that. I'm very happy to play at 3/7. I'm totally down to do that. Do I want to play it with Wiccan? Do I want to be, like, Quicksilvering into it? That's where things get a little bit more awkward. Like, this is a card that very much wants to be in a deck that is reliably playing all of its cards. And when you talk about decks like that, like, I think one that comes to mind maybe is Zoo, but Zoo can run into these weird location problems that prevent it from doing that. Maybe this is just, it's a 3 cost, maybe it just goes in Silver Surfer, except Silver Surfer is very often floating energy on 4 and 5, and thanks to Hope Summer, sometimes even on 6, making this card actually a lot smaller because of the way the awkwardness in that deck lines up. I guess my thought process is, this is a perfectly fine card that, honestly, if it releases, would be a card people should look into for competing at the 3-drop slot with cards like Gladiator, for example, but I don't think that's an exciting enough hook for this card to actually sell well. And because I don't think it's going to sell well, I don't think that's going to happen. Like, I don't think people are going to really investigate this card. If any of these cards get called a flop, I think this is the one that's likely to do it. Emperor Hulkling, a 6/11 that at the start of the game gets the text of a random 6-cost card. Okay, so this guy, I think, is going to generate an unparalleled amount of salt, because the delta between him being bad and him being good is so insane. Imagine playing an 11 power leader. That's completely busted. 11 power leader? What the hell? Alternatively, imagine playing 11 power Arnim Zola. Again, completely busted. What the hell? Imagine playing 11 power Galactus. Completely busted. What the hell? Downsides. Sometimes it's Destroyer. Like, there are some real issues here, right? Like, I do think there's a lot more hits than there are misses, and the hits are so wild. Like, one of the things that people, I think, are really talking about not liking about Arishem, and I don't really necessarily disagree with this, but it's worth giving voice to. People hate losing to the random generation. They view snapping as something that, like, has skill in it, and when something like this, where your opponent is able to snap on, say, 11 power Arnim Zola, and you look at that and you were like, how was I supposed to know they had 11 power Arnim Zola? And the answer is you weren't, and they're just like, okay, whatever, I guess I lose. A lot of, like, really good players hate that feeling, and so I expect this card to be a card that engenders that feeling. I'm actually really interested to compare the reception of this card to the reception to Arishem and see how much of it is just whether it's just like the power level of it or if they're actually like consistent about this not being a thing that they like, because the dynamics on this card are basically the same, where your opponent will have this hidden information that they can snap on and you will have no reasonable way of playing around, and that is what this card is going to do. And the question is just one of power level, where like, will that be worth including? Is that like the kind of thing where it's like, oh, nice job, you did really good there, or is it not so much? There are tons of good hits here. Like, just hitting Mockingbird is pretty good a lot of the time, depending on what deck you're playing. Hitting Null in a Destroy deck, obviously ridiculous. The issue is, where does this card go? There aren't a lot of decks that are thirsty for 6-drops, and the ones that are very often thirsty for a specific type of effect, right? I want a Doctor Doom. I want a Blob. I want a Magneto. I need these specific effects because, I don't know, I'm a Storm deck and I want Doom and Magneto, or I'm a RSM deck and I want a Blob, right? What deck wants this, I think, is going to be a really interesting question, because when you think about decks that could just free roll cards like this, it's like Thanos used to be able to do that, and I think, you know, Thanos Lockjaw might still be able to do that. Lockjaw decks do seem like an interesting place for this, but the downside of it is like notably high. I wonder about this card because I think it's going to be ultimately a little bit of a card that doesn't necessarily find a home unless it finds a home everywhere, right? Like, unless we play with this card and we realize, oh, this is actually just like the best 6-drop in the game. You put it in everything. It goes everywhere. It's just going to be awesome, which is possible legitimately, because the upside of this card is so ridiculous and so impossible to play around that there is like, oh, I got Sasquatch off of this. Cool. Free Sasquatch. Love that, right? Like, oh, I got Zola. Oh, I got Leader. There's just a bunch of weird stuff that can really go right for you with this card. And I think that the delta on this card, like my error bars with this card, it could be anywhere from like, this doesn't go in anything, to I'm putting this in everything. It's probably the card I'm the least sure about over the entire season, because my instincts say it's far more likely that it doesn't really make a difference in the metagame than the alternative. But if it does make a difference in the metagame, it's going to make a huge difference in the metagame. And I think it's hard to square those to me internally. I'm excited for this card. I really just am excited to see what it is that the people who've been complaining about these sort of hard to snap aspect of RSM do about this, and how much of it is related to I lose to RSM versus I don't lose to Hulkling. I'm interested to see how that sort of bears fruit. But mostly I think that, you know, RSM, obviously a much better version of this in terms of power, in terms of leveraging the like sort of lack of knowledge your opponent has about what the possibilities are, right? As far as this card itself goes, instincts, I think I think there's a lot up in the air for this season, but this is the one that feels like the most like cards that are already in the game, or the most in line with the power level of cards that are already in the game, which is to say, it's probably going to be a pretty good 6-drop. If it ends up being best in slot 6-drop, it'll have a massive effect. If it ends up being pretty good 6-drop, it'll have a pretty minimal effect. All right, y'all, so let's talk about overall impressions. First up, Kate Bishop, I think, is by far the best card of the season, by far the card I'm the most excited for, by far the card that is the scariest, the most interesting, everything. I obviously want to play her in Thena Mockingbird decks. That does seem completely ridiculous. I think a lot of people are going to be like, oh, I should play her in Loki. I'm not really so sure about that, based on the hand size stuff earlier. I want to see if she's going to be competitive with Jeff in terms of being a generically strong 2-drop. I think that is entirely possible as well. Marvel Boy, I don't really see as a needle mover for Zoo, more of a role player, but like a very good role player. I hope it catapults Zoo back into the metagame, because Zoo is always a deck I enjoy being around. I think when Zoo is a great deck, Marvel Snap's usually in a pretty healthy place, and I know there are certain people who would argue that it hasn't been in a healthy place in a while, thanks to the card RSM. So obviously I hope that a card like Marvel Boy can catapult a more fair deck like Zoo into a higher spot in the metagame. As far as Wiccan goes, I think Wiccan might need a buff. I think Speed might need a buff. I want them to be a Quicksilver Domino type thing, but I worry that it's just not enough payoff for what you're risking, which is I'm not drawing the good cards in my deck with Quicksilver Domino in my deck. Like, I'm just not doing that. And so I haven't really sort of figured out the deck building puzzle that is Wiccan yet, and I don't really expect him to be figured out very easily, and I think that is kind of an issue. Speed, on the other hand, is a card where I look at it and I'm like, well, the numbers on this card are actually just really good. I almost wonder if it might have like the Red Hulk thing where it releases and people are like, I don't know how good that actually is. And then people play with it and they're like, oh, that's just like big as hell. That guy's huge. And I think that's entirely possible with Speed, where he looks underwhelming, but like in practice that's a 3-7 to 3-9, like basically every game. And I think there are decks that are interested in having a 3-7 to 3-9 for sure. It's just that the competition is so fierce when you're comparing it with something like Nocturne, who can move and you don't really like run the risk of getting your investments invalidated, and there's not really a lot of counterplay to, and has all this upside with Limbo, even if she does cost you AQ sometimes. Like, I worry that Speed is unexciting, but good, and I worry that Wiccan is exciting, but not good. Finally, Emperor Hulkling is a card that has a lot of delta on it for me, where I'm just not really sure where in that range it's going to land. I think it could land anywhere from this is the best 6-drop in the game to this is like the 7th best 6-drop in the game. And if it ends up being like the 7th best 6-drop in the game, we're talking like, you know, it's worse at being a generic big guy than, you know, Red Hulk and Magneto. It's worse at spreading across lanes than Doctor Doom. It's worse at being discounted than Scar, than Mockingbird, than Sasquatch. Yeah, like, then it's probably not making a lot of, like, it's got to be better at something at doing those things. It's got to have a role. That's what I'm saying. It needs to have a role. Unless we play this card and it ends up just being, like, the best, like, so much better than Red Hulk, because on balance, you're getting so much more. I think that's the space that it has to move into, which is, if you are a deck that is interested in a 6-drop, you're playing, like, a Pixie deck or whatever, you play Hulkling instead of Red Hulk. That's the space that I think it can potentially occupy. And I think that's entirely possible. I don't think it's going to occupy any of the other spaces, but it is possible that it sort of occupies the generic, strong, large 6-drop spot just because of how insane the upside is when you hit something good on it. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through the Yapatron 6900. That's what I'm calling these now. Someone called it the Yapatron 5000. Oh, someone actually also called these Marvel Yap, which, for the record, trademarked. Nobody better steal that. I, as a white man, need a third podcast. I think it's like contractually obligated in the white guy handbook. I have to do it. And if I do it, it will be named Marvel Yap. Thank you so much. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.